Look, you're Brian Grazer. Anyone's going to take your phone call. How do I ever get a meeting with Carl Sagan or Isaac Asimov or any one of those people?
And I said, just have a cup of coffee with me right now, please. I learned more in that hour than I did in his entire class.
It kind of takes a lot of courage to just invent something like that to go meet this person. How did you even come up with that?
I said to J-Lo, please, you're gonna have to excuse me. And she said, well, I'm just in the middle of this song. I said, I know, but it's Oprah Winfrey.
This is months of 100+ people just trying to work his way through the whole system.
Instead of watching some guy and just feel like, oh, that person is crazy, it'd be good for us to know what that person's going through so you could care.
Brian, such a pleasure. When I was researching for this podcast, I thought I knew you well. I'd followed your work, seen all your movies, like everybody listening to this. But what really struck me was your childhood experience with dyslexia. And I am curious about a couple of things. One is, would love you to share with the audience how that impacted you and shaped you. And the second part which struck me was you are so fantastic at observing people and making connections with people in ways a lot of regular people. And I was curious whether your overcoming dyslexia kind of gave you other kinds of superpowers, which made you more observant, made you better able to connect people in ways just, a lot of others are not able to.
I think it has given me an advantage, the fact that I had dyslexia, which was pretty scarring. And growing up with acute dyslexia as a kid, you were just classified as dumb. You just this kid doesn't get it. He can't read. He can't spell. In classrooms, it sort of forced you in groups. It forced you to behave differently. It forced you to anticipate and avoid questions that would have required reading. Mm-hmm. So, in order to avoid questions that would be connected to reading, you had to be pretty ingenious. So you had to invent momentary illnesses or a cough or start sneezing or hiccuping or variety of different behaviors that aren't really even a byproduct of any of those things. They're just invented to survive potential embarrassment by not knowing simple answers to questions that would have been learned by reading. So it was relatively painful. It's painful for anyone that has any disability, and of course I'm more familiar with dyslexia, but I did make a movie that was kind of generated because of my sensitivity to that.
We're going to get into that, obviously, maybe some of your best work. One huge theme of your life has been these curiosity conversations. And there's an amazing book, which we're going to link to. Could you talk to us about, some people who watch this may go, look, you're Brian Grazer. Anyone's going to take your phone call. Anyone's going to reply to your email. But you actually started when you were nobody, really. And you were able to get meeting some really famous people. So talk to us about that, because, the people who are watching this may go like, how do I ever get a meeting with Carl Sagan or, Isaac Asimov or any one of those people? But you started at a very young age.
I started at a very young age also, partly because of my dyslexia, which I think you're alluding to, because it's just so much easier for me to learn interactively. And it's so easier for anyone with dyslexia to learn interactively. Probably the beginning of this started my graduation day from USC. I graduated college. I was, in the last few years, really able to excel in testing because I figured out a system of testing, of how to test. And it was very successful. And so I graduated, with honors, and then asked myself a rhetorical question. I was always a kid that asked a lot of questions, always. And my grandmother was my mentor, and she would constantly support and validate the idea of asking questions, that asking questions wasn't some show of ignorance. It wasn't showing something that would be weakness. It would be something that would be powerful to ask questions. So I asked myself this rhetorical question: what did I learn at USC? And quickly answered, nothing. I don't think I learned really much of anything. And I thought, well, okay, I must have learned something. This is like internal dialogue I was having. And I thought, well, what I learned was to cope with larger populations of people, how to, deal with large populations of people, survive and excel in large populations of people.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one thing. And then I thought, well, I had one class. It was abnormal psychology, a 480 class, because that was what I ended up graduating in. And his name was Dr. Milton Walpin. I obviously remember it pretty vividly. Mm-hmm. And I thought, I want to go see Dr. Milton Walpin, because the class that I was in with him was quite large. It was in excess of 300 students.
Wow.
So it was huge. And I tracked him down in the summer pretty quickly. It wasn't easy. And then he said, well, what are you doing now? I mean, you don't need me, you've already graduated, didn't you? Right. I said, well, I did, but you really stuck out in my mind. And so he was kind of trying to blow me off, like, politely, like, well, great. Good to meet you. Good to see you again. I said, just have a cup of coffee with me right now, please. So I sort of found my way into having a cup of coffee that I turned into about an hour conversation. And boy, did I learn a lot. I learned more in that hour than I did in his entire class. And I thought that was fundamentally true of most of my classes.
What did you learn specifically? What was he teaching then?
What he was teaching was different forms of behavioral therapy. And he was teaching mirroring techniques.
Oh, I see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Neuro-linguistic programming.
Got it. Okay. Wow.
So that's what he was teaching. And that was at its most nascent stage. Mm-hmm. By the way, neuro-linguistic programming was experienced by firewalking originally. The people that could actually walk on those red hot coals were able to do that because of neuro-linguistic programming. That was the way they were able to do that. So,
wait, hold on. I'm just maybe on a tangent. How does that work? Right? How does NLP help you with not getting your feet burned?
Well, it was physiologically proven that your feet wouldn't get burned. It was just the pain that you would feel.
Right.
And so there was a way to block the pain by doing this mirroring technique.
Right.
And as you know, then it was later used in study groups where if there's 100 salespeople at desks all in one room, one big room, arena, and we did a baseline of their success level. If they all had offices, they did twice as well, because they imagined themselves to be in a better status than they were with 100, as opposed to being at a desk with 100 other people.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Well, I know that makes sense, right? Because
and I'm guessing at that point, when you were talking to this teacher, NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, was very early. Like, it isn't the hot thing that it is today where everyone's like talking about it. You sat down for coffee, you talked to this guy, and what happens from there?
What what ultimately happened from there is I had to get a job. Well, this takes me into my life story. But what happened is, I had to get a summer job, and I was planning to go. I'd been accepted to go to law school at USC. I was going to go to law school just because I didn't know what else to do. Like, okay, what do I do? What further education? So I thought, okay, I'll go the direction of law. And so I just happened to be in my apartment. I'm trying to abbreviate this, but I was in my apartment complex in Santa Monica on Ocean Avenue. Yeah. And I overhear these 3 law school graduates about the easiest job anyone could possibly imagine. That's how they're talking about it. And they're just blowing it off like, it was so easy. My job was much easier than your job. They're doing a comparative on what was the easiest job. So I overheard that it was a law clerk job, and it happened to be at Warner Brothers Pictures. Now, I knew nothing about movies at all, really, and I didn't really even think about Warner Brothers Pictures, and I didn't really think about that I live in Hollywood, where Warner Brothers and MGM and all the major studios were, because it just wasn't in my vision. It just wasn't what I was thinking about. So I just overhear about the job, and this guy just quit, and I call, at the time it's 843-6000. I asked for Peter Connect's office, reached the office, talked to his assistant, and I conned my way into going in for an interview because the job was now vacant that day. Right. So I get the job the same day that this guy quit, which was 3:00 in the afternoon on a Friday. And now I'm a law clerk at Warner Brothers, whatever that means.
But you have your foot in the door, right? You're now inside.
Now I'm inside. Not knowing really what inside was, but I was inside. And so the job was easy. The first week I had absolutely nothing at all to do in my it was about a 6 by 10 foot cubicle with no windows. And then that second week, someone came in and says, "You're delivering these papers." And I said, "Okay, what are these papers?"
Yeah.
They're documents that are to go to Warren Beatty, who's at the time the most famous movie star in the world. And so I'm now delivering the papers to Warren Beatty. It's a big, thick stack, and trying to hand the papers to Warren Beatty at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. Mm-hmm. So his assistant comes down, says, "Just give me the papers." I say, "I can't give the papers to you. They're invalid unless I hand them directly to Mr. Beatty," which of course I just invented that on the spot.
Right. But how did you think about that? That's just, it's not something that, especially when you're really young and you're meeting somebody incredibly famous, it's very intimidating, right? Like you have these like assistants, you have a lot of people around them. It's kind of takes a lot of courage to just invent something like that to go meet this person. How did you even come up with that?
Well, I just think that everything is like dating. I mean, businesses are like dating. Businesses are like dating. Meeting is like dating. Everything is dating.
Yeah.
And you have to invent stories. You just have to come up with stuff. So I was a good dater.
By the way, I love that you say that every one of your curiosity conversations, something that you think about is, how do I make this the best date that you've ever had? Mm-hmm. Kind of tying this kind of all back to.
Actually, you're exactly right. I do think to myself, my goal is to make my curiosity conversation the best date that Isaac Asimov or Edward Teller could ever have, or awesome. A Barack Obama, or whoever it is. I mean, I've met with everybody from Princess Di to Margaret Thatcher. I had this great conversation with her. I mean, so you have to make it juicy. You have to make it fun. You have to, I mean, they don't want to just talk about facts, and they don't want to hear the question of like, "Hey, what's your job like?" Or the generalized questions never fly, as you guys know.
Right.
Oh yeah. But I think the key part is you have to be entertaining, right? Like, okay, I want to this is probably the most exciting part of this for me, and I really wanted to get into the brass tacks. So, the curiosity conversations. Now, of course, you don't need this anymore. You have a system. You are who you are. Yeah. But earlier on, you had this amazing instinct for dealing with the gatekeepers, the assistants, the admins, the PR teams. And it's funny, we had Sagar and Jerry, who hosts a very popular show on our podcast recently, and he was talking about how he got to interview Trump in the previous administration. And he spent a year helping set up Trump's staff on dates and grabbing drinks with them before he got in access to prison.
And this is months of 100+ people just trying to work his way through the whole system.
And I saw that. I was like, wait, this is exactly what you talk about. So talk to us about, even before the conversation, how do you deal with the gatekeepers?
Oh my God. They are the most important. I mean, I will literally do anything to entertain the 3 assistants that somebody has. But I write a letter, I type an email. In the day, I would actually write letters. And then what I would do is I'd make sure to follow up. I'd say, who can I follow up with? Or I would just absolutely find the way. I don't often, I'm going to challenge that. I don't usually ask the subject, how do I follow up? I've already figured out how to follow up. I'm sure you guys know that yourselves, having done startups. And so, because everything is a startup. I mean, making a movie is a startup, making a TV show, meeting a new person where there's no overlapping agenda is a startup. So basically what I would do is I would definitely entertain the assistants, make them laugh, be genuinely interested. People detect if you're not. It's easy for me to be genuinely interested because I actually, the 1 or two or three things that, I would embody as characteristics. I am really interested in people. I find endless amount of mysteries living in each person and secrets.
Right.
And so I do that. Even with my three assistants, incidentally, I still always dial myself. I will not let them make the outgoing phone call. I don't want the assistant to have to put their boss on hold. I don't want anyone to wait. Right. I want to make it really comfortable for...
You said once that you learned that from Oprah Winfrey on how she just dials people directly and just like deals with other people that she wants to get on her show or just work with or talk to directly. Is that kind of where it comes from?
I don't think it might have been influenced by that.
Right.
I was actually I really wanted to meet Oprah Winfrey, by the way.
Yeah.
And really, really, really wanted to. And I'd already made a lot of movies and I was pretty successful, but I just thought she's not going to know who I am and it won't matter. And I was making a movie with Spike Lee at the time called Inside Man with Denzel Washington.
Yes.
And the two of them just go, "She knows who you are, Grazer." I go, "I don't know." And so, I called directly. I did a few things and they said she's going to call back. And I said to Spike, maybe you could call so she will call back. No, she's going to call you back. So now I happen to be in a meeting with J-Lo, and J-Lo is singing 5 songs. She goes, "I just did these 5 songs. They're all in Spanish. You want to hear?" So I'm listening to her and she's like one-on-one. I'm at my desk. She's right in front of me performing these 5 songs. And in the middle of her 4th song, they say, "Oprah Winfrey's on the line." I go, "Oh my God." And so I said to J-Lo, "Please, you're going to have to excuse me." And she said, "Well, I'm just in the middle of this song." I said, "I know, but it's Oprah Winfrey," because it blew my mind so much. And it was she on the phone with my assistant. And that did influence me. And I jumped right on, talked to her, and it was really gratifying. And I met with her the following day.
Okay, I want to get into the actual conversation because I find this interesting, and you and I talk about how to do some of these because you have a little bit of a dance, right? You are very curious. You want to understand something about the other person. You also want to offer value. Like, no real successful, accomplished person, just wants to, talk about what they are doing or, what they know. You want to be, and genuinely be interested and offer some value to them. What is the perfect first conversation with somebody for you?
It usually makes it work where I start off by saying, "Did you know?" And then I tell them, like with Dr. Dre, I said, "Do you know the song Exodus?" It's a theme song because I thought to myself, one of the creative ingredients to his music that is really differentiating is his music is melodic. So it's not just, it's just not yelling. It's not aggressive that way. It's, he often has great melodies. So I thought to myself, what song has, that really resonated for me has a great melody? And that's the theme song to the movie Exodus, which I think was like 1976, but it's a great song. It's really beautiful, really symphonic and beautiful. Or Jay-Z, I brought up with Jay-Z, who, he's such a superstar. He's amazing and a person that, you want to be on your toes because he's relaxed in manner, but he's as sharp as you could possibly be, like really quite brilliant. And I brought up Amadeus, which is about genius. And he didn't know it, but he brought up the word genius. And I said, well, a movie that really defined genius to me. And then, so I was able to teach him something or show him something that he hadn't already seen. So that interested him. And then he came up with the tagline to our documentary that we were making. We were making a documentary at the time called Made in America, which was a music doc. But he said, there's a little bit of genius in all of us. And I thought that was really poetic and kind of beautiful. And that became the defining or the signature of this piece that we did together.
It's amazing. And I think one of the things which I love in what you do is
you have to give somebody something. Yes.
Yeah. And I think it's hard sometimes, when I meet somebody or you meet somebody and you're a fan, and you've grown up idolizing that person, you get a little starstruck. I mean, even if you're used to something, you get a little starstruck. And it's interesting because I was talking to a really famous movie star, and they said on the other side, you feel pressure because this person's a fan and you want to give them something memorable. But you've talked about that movie a million times, right? And you are now on the pressure, like, how do I not disappoint this person, with all the experience? So I think it's an interesting dynamic on both sides of that conversation.
Yeah, I think there is too. I hadn't thought of that because, like you, I have a very inaccurate perception of myself. It would appear similar to you, by the way. I think we're fundamentally humble people. And so I wouldn't normally think, oh my God, I'm going to have some impact on them. I definitely always I put myself in the position of performance.
Right. I'm a
great guest. Have me over for dinner. I'll be one of your favorite guests.
Yeah.
You're on.
I think that's great. Just reading through the movies that you've made, part of me, what really strikes me is how you being curious, just innately curious. And this is across a lot of articles we've read, you went on podcasts, and that just this constant thread of curiosity comes up. I was wondering how much of that led you to do movies you met with, Nash and his wife, and, later on came up like The Beautiful Mind, similarly meeting Eminem. How much do you attribute curiosity to your success in the world of movies?
100%. 100%. I mean, first of all, the first thing that comes to mind is that at the end of the line is trying to find a movie star to help personify that story that you've created or that you've nurtured, into life. And so everybody wants Tom Hanks and everybody wants Denzel Washington.
Right.
So I always felt like I had a competitive advantage because I had because I had so many of these curiosity conversations, which gave me a variety of subjects that I could turn to like a tool at any given moment. And I always would show that off a little bit to, whether it's, or Eddie Murphy. I've done 6 or 7 movies with him, and same with the other guys I just mentioned. And it's just, I think that they know that someday making this movie, we're going to be in a foxhole, at least one. At least one foxhole. We won't have the money to shoot a scene. There'll be some problem with another. There's always problems.
Right.
Even in the perfect scenario. It's the same way with you guys in businesses. There's always a problem within the singular narrative. And so I think they see that as a competitive advantage. They figure Grazer will figure it out. I somehow feel like it's never been stated to me, but I do think that is a conscious or subconscious advantage that I might have, that they would think, oh, he'll figure it out because he either knows these people or he knows the subject that leads to something else. Look, I say, you probably read in the book, I kind of say, I made this movie called How the Grinch Stole Christmas with Jim Carrey.
Yep.
Yes.
And Jim Carrey was quitting about a week before the movie was to start. Maybe it's 2 weeks. And he said, I'm going to quit because this is just too hard. It's too hard to do 6 hours of prosthetics every day, to wear these contact lenses to make his eyes green, because that's part of which it was just so painful sealing off all of his pores. And he said, I'm going to give back all the money that you guys advanced me. I'm going to give you back the entire thing plus interest. I'm out. And because I met a man that was expert in teaching the CIA and State Department how to survive torture. He was a torture relief specialist that started in the FBI, but he's very, very, very well known. And I'd met with him, and I thought he will have some technique, because Jim Carrey is feeling as though he is tortured. It's exactly the same as being a soldier buried alive in a hole for a week. For Jim. And which, of course, I know of a soldier that I talked to that was buried alive in a hole for 2 full weeks, a French soldier, and survived. So I was very interested in survival, and I've met many other people. Veronica de Negre in Chile was tortured in a Chilean prison unpredictably for 18 straight months. So it's a subject I was interested in, not only how you survive, but all the different aspects of that. So I was able to bring that expertise to Jim, gave him a weekend with this man, came in from Virginia. And on Monday, he said, I can do it. I'm in. I'll stay in. And he used the techniques that this man taught him potentially, to survive and to do his best work.
Wow, that's an amazing story. Which, I want to bring to something else on just the movies you made. This is actually a good segue. Some of your best work, for example, Apollo 13, Beautiful Mind. One thing that strikes me is the ending, right? That the crew is not dying; they're going to make it back. But so much of the movie is about the internal psychological drama, makeup, scar tissue, which makes it fascinating. And I think and you especially, I think, have such a unique way to make it all work. So talk to us about that, because as an outsider of the movie industry, you go like, well, how is it these movies where the heroes survive, it because you probably know they didn't, but they are so engrossing. Break that apart for us.
Okay, and I just produced another movie that Ron Howard also directed, because those two you just referred to, Apollo 13 and 13 Lives, that's out right now. You do know they survived. You knew that these 13 Thai kids survived. Yeah. In the case of Apollo 13, these guys did too. So basically, you have to create, as you point out, internal drama, really suspense. And the way you do that is you have to do a lot of cutting. This is something Ron invented on Apollo 13, and probably somebody did it before Ron at some point in his life. But he basically constructed a scenario where you're cutting back and forth to mission control, from the capsule of mission control to the children's lives, the kids, their sons and daughters' lives, to a priest. You're creating symbols that show the potential tragedy that this could become, who it would impact, meaning, the kids and family, and in the end, the world, because it does, the movie Apollo 13 wasn't just about that. It was really about the space program. Does the space program survive? Does it work? And that was a similar thing that we did with 13 Lives. Coincidentally, the 13 is involved for some reason.
I was going to say, it's like the Brian Ron 13, duo, maybe trilogy in the making, which actually is a fantastic segue, because I really want to talk to you about Ron Howard, right? So you and Ron have had a fantastic partnership for decades. By the way, folks haven't listened, you were both on the Invest Like the Best podcast recently with Patrick O'Shaughnessy, which was fantastic, fabulous. And, I grew up, by the way, in India watching Ron on reruns of Happy Days. Which is actually a bit before my time, but they used to have these reruns on Indian TV, and I used to grow up with him and, Henry Winkler and everybody. Talk to us about how you and Ron met, and also it is so unique to have these partnerships just last, and how do you complement each other? What is your process as kind of individuals, human beings, creators over these decades? Okay,
well, I met Ron through a curiosity conversation. So basically, he was just a victim. I yelled out my window at Paramount Studios, where I had an office, and I yelled, "Hey, Ron!" He was I was on the third floor. He was down walking, and I think I scared the shit out of him. He'd be like, Ron, it's me, Brian. He didn't know me, but I was making a lot of noise, which I'm very able to do. And then I called his assistant. I worked her really hard and said, I was the guy that yelled at Ron Howard. He was the guy that ducked around a corner to get away from the guy that's yelling at him.
Yeah, by the way, but a pro tip for everyone listening, do not yell at Ron Howard on the street as a way to meet him, right? There are better ways.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the caveat. So in any event, so we meet, and he came into my office, and I just thought he had an aura about him that revealed goodness and that anything, goodness in many ways, the way, good heart, that he'd be successful, that he was successful. He just hadn't climbed this one mountain, which was making a big theatrical film. And nor had I at the time. So we both were aspiring to do the same thing. And I sort of had, according to my grandmother, had the gift or gab. so I could get us into the right meetings. It wasn't easy to get the first movie made, but we did. And the second one was a little bit harder, about a man and a mermaid falling in love, which everyone thought that was just the stupidest idea of all. But in any event, so that's how I met Ron. And the chemistry was really good. And we do different things. I understood how to really understood it even in my early stage after being this law clerk, how to navigate the terrain of Hollywood. With that, I understood what people psychologically needed. Whether it was a person that was chairman of a studio, or whether it was Lew Wasserman, whether it was Warren Beatty, any of these people, I could understand what is it that they want, what do they value, I guess.
Yeah.
And then of course what their leverage is in the business itself. And so I did learn pretty early on that ideas are the umbrella of all employment. So I was good at inventing and industrializing movie ideas.
Wait, explain that a bit. That's a fascinating sentence. What does that mean?
It means that what I just said is what it meant was that one can, in the case, I was able to come up with basically one-line ideas. And the one line, followed by a sentence, followed by a paragraph, should be transporting you to another place.
Give us an example. Give us an example. Like what would, if any one of you...
What's an idea that became that?
Well, the Mermaid movie was one, right?
Okay.
It was about transporting people into a love story that was unattainable. And it's unattainable because she's a mermaid and lives in the ocean.
Right.
So she has also, in that movie, we gave her powers because I wanted her to have power. Not only just elusiveness, but just have power. We actually, no one had ever done this, but we shot a stunt double out of a cannon in the ocean in the Bahamas and shot them into the sky to prove that they had power to leap beyond anyone's possible capability. So, and all characters, any movie that's successful, the character almost always has power. I actually learned that from Jim Carrey. I didn't think of power. And he said, all comedy is about power. And I thought that was true, that all comedy is about power. Ultimately.
How so? Because one version of what I've heard, which is, when you're listening to a certain kind of comedian, right? For example, a Chappelle or Rogan, for example. By the way, your podcast, Rogan, again, is spectacular. Highly recommend people to watch that. And I think Rogan's take is when you're listening to one of these amazing comedians, for a few minutes, you are entering their world and they're walking you through their process, right? Like Logan will be like, and all of a sudden you're like, who brought the baby in? And you're like, yeah, that makes sense. And there is sort of like a power over the audience in terms of constructing a narrative and a worldview, which then people follow through. That's one sense of it. But what do you mean when you say, or what does Jim Carrey mean when he says comedy is about power?
He means that initially he's capable of creating a bridge between you and all audiences. The same thing as Chappelle. He creates a bridge where he's accessible, but he's saying stuff that lives in your brain that you're not even aware that you're thinking about. And he has the power to pull that out of your brain and entertain you and ultimately put a spell on you, hypnotize you. So often it's really with Chappelle, his execution is so profoundly brilliant. He's sometimes less about what he says, but the hypnosis that he puts you under.
We've been watching The White Lotus season 2 recently. Yeah. It's fantastic. And one thing we were discussing with some friends was, why is everyone talking about the show? And obviously it's very well done. It's engrossing. It's funny. And but I think there is a sense of these characters who seem outlandish, weird, and you make fun of. Also, you see shades of yourself in them, right? If you're in a relationship, you see stage of the couple. If you have a dad or a son, you have, your relationship that you're working through, these shades of that. And I think there is this kind of this tension between how you're making fun of them, but maybe deep down, maybe in some ways you want to acknowledge or not acknowledge yourself. You're like, I relate to some aspect of this character, and there's something magical in there.
Yeah, I so agree with you. In fact, I watched the last episode of season 2 last night. It's exactly right. Like, just the fact you guys did too.
Yeah. We did. We can spoil it here, right? Like, we can spoil it on this show.
No, don't spoil it.
We won't spoil it. We won't spoil it. But it's basically like, even if you think you've convinced yourself that you're moral and you have never had an affair, nor would you often have fantasies of an affair. And I think what they're saying is, you can't deny these fantasies. They live in you.
Yeah, and there's sometimes it's so simple, right? For example, and I wish I had Murray Abraham's voice and articulation. I don't, but he's saying about, and sometimes you just want to come home to a warm embrace from a woman. And there's some very simple thing about the homecoming and everyone looking forward to home they can go to, which is so simple and profound. Beautiful show.
Yeah, I think what works in the show, like, I think it's almost kind of the opposite, where it's like, it's not that you watch it to make fun of these people. I think you watch it because they're endearing to you in some way. I think you look at them and you go, I feel that.
They prove to you that we're all flawed, right?
Yes, exactly. And, we are all, in spite of all these messy, flawed behavior, we can go do some like really interesting things, outside of the show context and everything else.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point. That's a very good point.
Though on the show, I would say, Portia, you should not get in the car if you're being kidnapped. No, don't do that. I was like, no, get out of the car.
I think that's also like our Indian instincts. I think it's like, oh, this is a guy you don't trust. Like, what are you doing? Like, half the time,
run away, get out of the car.
Get out of the car.
Anyway. Okay, so this is going to be a fun bit. I want to talk to you about people you had curiosity connections, but also people you've worked with. And talk to us about maybe what makes them special in their craft or as a human. And I'm going to pick somebody, you had a long conversation with, Tom Hanks, right? We've all watched all of his movies. And I have actually a story about Tom, which I'll get to. But I want to ask you, what makes him so special in maybe way as we as civilians don't understand?
Well, I think we saw that, like, in the very first movie that he'd ever done was the one that, where we, the mermaid movie. He falls in love with a mermaid. Is that he doesn't have the flashy role. He's not the hooky, the character. He's not Jack Nicholson,
right,
or Michael Keaton for that matter. He doesn't have that hooky character, where he's where those guys are spectacular. They're perfect. They are the most fun of all time. But you couldn't really be with them all day. Whereas you can be with Tom Hanks all day. And Tom Hanks will entertain you, but he won't do it in the same way they will do it.
Right.
You will definitely root for Tom Hanks's survival and success always. And that's kind of why, he was mostly known for comedy, but we cast him in Apollo 13 because I thought to myself, well, because Kevin Costner was an obvious choice and a lot of these action stars were obvious choices. And then I thought, but who does the world want to save the most? And I thought, Tom Hanks the world wants to save Tom Hanks the most.
Right.
So he just, he ignites the empathy in all of us.
One of the things we got to meet Tom a little bit and kind of got to know him a little bit over the last few years. I have sort of a scorecard for famous people that I meet, which is what is the difference between how you expect them to be based on their public perception and body of work, and how are they in person once they kind of drop the first 30, 40 minutes of the show they put on. And one of the things I really appreciate about Tom is he is probably the closest to how you expect him to be, right? If you've seen his movies, and by the way, not everybody's like that, and this is not movies. Like sometimes you see a famous CEO, they seem like a genuine warm person. turns out they're like a total jerk, right? Or or for example, sometimes comedians, right? Comedians are really interesting because they don't want to perform, they don't want to be funny. Like they can be some very interesting people. But Tom, he is exactly how you think he is going to be at all times. At least the times I spent with him, and that is like a very unique thing for me.
Yeah, it is very unique. He is like that, but most comedians that are gigantically entertaining alone, they're kind of, or in a small group, they're really shy. They're shy. They don't. It takes a lot to get them out, come out.
Right.
I think sometimes they don't want to perform, and I think they're also fantastic observationists. So they want to because it's kind of raw material for them, but they don't perform. Now, okay, so this is somebody interesting. You had curiosity connection people that are not good human beings that you don't agree with, and I want to ask you about Castro. Right? You met him, you had a conversation with him. How was it to
met him in Cuba?
In Cuba, right? And this is kind of the peak of his powers. How was it to meet him, talk to him? And in those conversations, right? Like, I'm curious, like, was there something that you could relate to him about? Was there something that impressed you? Also in the context of, okay, this is not maybe a good human being in a lot of ways. How was that whole conversation?
Well, yeah, you go into the meeting, knowing everything about Fidel. And that he's not only survived a lot of assassinations, that he himself has killed a lot of people himself, right? I mean, he's been pretty ruthless in his very long term. So that, but by it was about a 6-hour lunch, and kind of halfway in, you realize he just knows everything about the basic needs of the human beings on this little island, Cuba. He knows every single thing about their basic needs, their everyday life, what they need, what their survival, education, family life. I often say he knew the physics of the island better than anyone you could imagine. He knew what a kilowatt represented to a light bulb in a house up in the mountains with limited electricity. I mean, he just knew everything, and he was able to particleize the island in a way that was very seductive. You start to think, okay, now I get it. I get why the people are so indebted, loyal to him. Why he has, this kind of power over them.
Right.
Do you think that gives you some insight into how cult leaders work? Sure. What makes them work? What's their appeal?
It definitely does. It definitely makes you feel like I get how people can be maneuvered into something that they wouldn't ordinarily do at all.
Right.
Because they are, really they find themselves like you're in a sustained state of awe when you're with someone like Fidel.
Right.
You're not supposed to call him Castro, you're supposed to go like this. That means Fidel. So when he was ready to meet with us, somebody came over and goes like this. So because you don't say Fidel, and you don't say if you say anything, you'd say Fidel, but normally you just go like that, and that means it's time.
Wow, that's crazy.
Okay. You know what? You should absolutely do that with your hair, right? You should be like, when somebody wants to meet you, just let's do the hair, right? Actually, the hair is actually very interesting, because you talked about this. Your hair didn't used to look this way. And, talk to us about how this hairstyle came to be.
Talk to us about the hair care treatment.
Well, yeah, that too. But also, I think in terms of it being a brand, it being a conversation starter, it's very interesting.
Well, Hollywood's built on iconography, right? I mean, just think of it like this. There are movie stars that are tremendous actors. And then there's a sighting. A sighting is different than just an Oscar-winning actor.
Right.
Leo DiCaprio is different than Daniel Day-Lewis.
Right.
They might be the same in talent, but Leo is a sighting. Daniel Day-Lewis, he's different. You might not know it's Daniel Day-Lewis, or there was a time when you didn't know what De Niro looked, but who De Niro was in a crowd.
Right.
Now you do, but. So I thought, well, then producers started to be their own icons, and they had beards and mustaches, or both beards and mustaches to get. And I thought, I need something. Right. But there wasn't really anything. I didn't have a bad temper, and at the time, bad tempers were tolerated. So I wasn't throwing plates and plates of food at people or typewriters, or I wasn't doing that.
Some of those folks have been canceled in recent years.
Yeah, they have now. Now they get canceled for that, of course. And I couldn't grow real facial hair to have a beard, and so I was kind of at a loss. And then one day I was swimming with my daughter, who was about 3.5 years old at the time, I popped my hair up, and she said, "Wow, I like your, a version of I like that." What? Oh, your hair. Anyway, so I popped it up, and it was much higher than this. Like, it was crazy. And I thought, I think I'll just do this. It's an interesting litmus test for people. They're either going to think it's cool or different or interesting, or they're going to just think I'm an asshole. And they did think both, by the way.
But they never ignored you. And they talked about it.
They never ignored me, no. So it became a thing.
Oh yeah. It's kind of like similar for us, which is like, I'm sort of tall, I'm 6'6", but we're together, and you're not like us, or but if you're kind of hard to ignore, right? We are memorable, which is often the first step, I think. I want to maybe go to your citing comment.
You are memorable, actually. I wasn't sure you were really memorable. I wasn't sure what you did when I met with Mark Andreessen and Chris and stuff, and then I realized, oh wait, I later learned you were a partner. I later learned all that, but you always have something to say. You're very kind, but you're not avoidable.
Thank you. I'm going to clip this out, and I'm going to use this forever. Thank you. That was so kind of you. I want to come back to the citing part, because there's been this recent conversation where Martin Scorsese, for example, said that the Marvel movies are not exactly cinema, and then there was recently a podcast with Tarantino where he talked about the movie stars in the actors in these Marvel movies are not real movie stars, in the sense that you are not going to one of these movies to watch X or Y that you might have, gone to a Robert De Niro or Redford movie, or, take Paul Newman, or think any of the classics. Right. Do you think that's true when you think of these huge franchises, be it Marvel, Star Wars, and also what does it mean for the future of a movie star, the Leo DiCaprios, the Brad Pitts, the Clooneys?
I think those guys, their future is even bigger today, because people are yearning now for those 90s 2000 movies, those movies that were built on movie stars, that were star vehicles, and because today it's very differentiating. They want them more than ever, because the movie going experience has been sort of pushed back to all streaming for the most part, and the differentiator is that big movie, or the movie that's personified through a movie star, that is kind of worthy of being seen in a theater with 1,000 people. So I think their careers are even more valuable. Their currency is even more valuable than it was even then.
Oh, yeah. One of my favorite scenes in Top Gun Maverick this summer is, amazing movie, for all the reasons people expect. But one of my favorite scenes is there's this bit where, Ed Harris tells Tom Hanks, "We don't need the likes of you anymore." And Tom Hanks says, "Maybe so, but not today." And I thought it was kind of such an interesting sort of fourth wall breaking moment of like, sorry, not Tom Hanks, Tom Cruise, but Tom Cruise going, "Hey, you know what? Like, maybe someday, you don't need the likes of somebody like me, but not today." So I thought it's such an interesting little meta moment, like right there.
I wanted to ask you about A Beautiful Mind. It's one of the movies that I love the most, and Sriram knows this. I love math, and just if you're following, it's one of those movies which is profoundly poetic, sad. You just go through this journey of this mathematician. I would love to know everything you know about this movie. Like, how did it get started? How did you even think about this? When you were meeting this couple, did you think of this as like, that would be a good movie? How did you think through the whole, conceptual part of it to like the actual movie making and finish?
Okay, well, I always wanted to make a movie that would help destigmatize mental disability. So that preceded meeting John Nash and Sylvia, John and Sylvia. And I was originally working on a movie that was based on a different, very successful schizophrenic that graduated top of his class, Yale Law School. But then I was doing it with Brad Pitt. And unfortunately, before us making the movie, he stabbed his fiance to death because he went off of his meds and became another narrative, another person. And so we had to just scratch that right away. Then I became literally aware of John and Sylvia Nash through a friend of mine named Graydon Carter, who was the editor of Vanity Fair. He told me, he said, why don't you look into this? This is something you're dying to do. Take a look at that. So I did. That was very helpful. And I always wanted people to be sensitized to human beings that have less than them, and it could be in this case was in the form of any disability. In the case of A Beautiful Mind, it was about schizophrenia, but it could have been a lisp, it could have been bipolarity, it could have been Asperger's, it could have been any type of disability that we just travel through life, and those people often are just invisible to us. We just keep driving or keep walking, and I knew that I did that myself periodically, even though I was very aware of all this. And so I thought, instead of watching some guy bang his head into a pole and just feel like, oh, that person is crazy, it'd be good for us to know what that person's going through so you could care or maybe do something about it. So that's kind of how the sum total of how it came about. Then there was a book that was A Beautiful Mind. It did not contemplate the beginning of the movie or the book being a thriller where you're living in the alternate reality. But because of a curiosity conversation I had with this woman that I brought up named Veronica de Negre, who was tortured in Chile, because I asked her, how did you survive this torture? And she said, by living in an alternate reality. And so that was a flashpoint for me. And I'd met her about 17 years before I even thought of doing A Beautiful Mind. But I remember that conversation vividly. And I remember what it looked like, because she was able to describe what that second story was, the one she could live in to survive. I thought, well, that's exactly what a schizophrenic goes through. And it's not invented, it's real. And just because it wasn't in the book, it's not something, it is something that we can still do. So that's why the movie was largely successful, because it lived in this alternate reality to start the movie, which changed the genre of a movie from a drama to a thriller. And thrillers have a lot of propulsion. That's what thrillers have. That's what they're all about. They don't survive unless they have propulsion. That's not an ingredient that's necessary for a melodrama or a drama.
I love that, because there's something about the story genre match that's sometimes magical, which that is such a fascinating bit. Okay, we're almost out of time, and I want to ask you one last thing, which is, say, many, many, many decades from now, let's say somebody's making the story of your life, and there is a amazing montage sequence set to music where it's charting the story of Brian, from yelling in the parking lot, through Beautiful Mind, through all the other movies before and after today. And what would you want the audience who watches that movie to go home feeling?
The emotion would be joy, celebration of triumph. Happiness. There's going to be sadness along the way, but ultimately happiness. Like happiness of, wow, all things are possible. I can do anything. Empowerment.
Well, I mean, Brian, I just want to say this has been such a fascinating hour, and you had such a fascinating life. And one thing is, in the Joseph Campbellian hero's journey, you fit the journey so well. It's been amazing to see what you've overcome, your sort of innate joy and curiosity, genuine curiosity in people, and which I think like shines through. And I think also everybody, I think I've been inspired, Aarthi's been inspired, everybody watching this can see like, okay, I can do some version of what you are doing, hopefully.
Yes.
But I suspect that movie, and all these movies so far, but that movie is going to leave people feeling definitely a bit sad, but definitely joyful and inspired at the end of it.
I think for me, I love how curious you are. And you continue to be. It's not like, oh, I've made it, I've become really wealthy and I know all the people and that's it, I'm done. Like you're still at this and you're still doing it. And it's great because, it's a core part of your personality, which I think is really inspiring. And I think people can cultivate that and you can always have this learning mindset. And I think that's really important. You've often talked about how movie making is a lot like tech startups, and starting a company is incredibly hard. I've done that, and it's just the journey that you go through. You kind of live in your head a little bit on like, are you crazy? Are you like, should you be doing this? What are you learning? And so I can see that, like just talking to you, I can see how it's so similar from what you're doing and the confidence that you give to your team on like, Brian's going to figure it out. I think that for me was very inspiring because that's what I aspire to do as a founder, to give that safety net to my employees and to my team and to my people and have that be there. I also think for me, the conversationalist part of you is probably the most interesting and exciting, where you think of every conversation as how do I entertain? How do I, make this a really good conversation for them? Like I can see your brain kind of go through this even during this conversation. You're trying to pull up anecdotes and stories that you haven't said before. And for me, we're new to the whole podcasting side of things. We learned so much just like watching you do this, and you've been doing this for such a long time. That's great. So inspiring for us.
Thank you. It was a joy for me to be with you both. This has been really cool. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Brian. Thanks, Brian. Okay, this was amazing. Thank you so much.
Subscribe to the YouTube channel, The Good Time Show by Aarthi and Sriram.